Imagine waking up in a medieval village, only to discover that someone or something has been lurking in the shadows, leaving terror and unsolved mysteries behind. How did communities with no forensics, no police, and only flickering torchlight hunt down the era's most twisted minds? What forgotten rituals and wild punishments did they use against history's first serial killers? Today, we're traveling back through time to uncover the chilling, real stories of psycho killers in the Middle Ages and the incredible ways they were finally caught. If you're fascinated by dark history, spine-chilling mysteries, and the secrets that shaped our world, make sure to hit that subscribe button. What part of medieval justice surprises or shocks you the most? Let us know in the comments below, and join our community of curious minds as we dive into the shadows of history together. Medieval Shadows: the epic tale of psycho killers, their capture, and punishment. Part 1. The gloom of Dark Ages, a world primed for nightmare. Let us begin not with fire or sword, but with a quiet throb of fear, the anxious pulse that haunted the medieval world after sundown. Hundreds of years before cities bustled and constables wore uniforms, the land that sprawled from fog-choked English moors to deep-polished woods was a patchwork of sleepy villages, isolated hamlets, hilltop castles, and fetid port towns, all tightly bound by a single thread: survival and suspicion. Imagine a time when every face was familiar, every stranger a possible threat. Crime was not an abstract force, but an intimate terror. In the absence of forensic science, street lighting, or even reliable written records, murder was often a personal violation, slashing through the fabric of fragile communities like a bolt of lightning. The consequences were swift, sometimes haphazard, and all-consuming. In this world, psycho killers were more than a grim anomaly. They were the monsters of fairy tales made horrifyingly real. Unlike battlefield carnage or vendetta killings, these were souls whose pleasure or compulsion resided in the act of killing itself. Their actions baffled their contemporaries, inspiring not only fear but a morbid curiosity that lingers in the legends and legal scrolls they left behind. Society lived on guard. Each evening, tight clusters of thatched houses shimmered with candlelight, while villagers locked doors, whispered charms, and eyed their neighbors. News, when it arrived, came on the lips of traders, clergy, or errant soldiers. In this world, the sudden, unexplained vanishing of a traveler or child set panic racing through narrow lanes. If a body was discovered in the morning haze, throat cut, limbs twisted, sometimes carved in ritual or grotesque excess, the effect was electrifying. The village bell tolled. Neighbors gathered, voices tumbling over one another, trying to make sense of the crime. And swiftly, the hue and cry erupted, a cacophony of calls that pressed every able-bodied resident into action. With crude torches, pitchforks, dogs, and the righteous fury of fear, they stalked the land in search of the killer. But how does justice function in such a world? Who were the men and women who dared to investigate evil in an age before evidence? Their tales are as rich with courage as they are with error and brutality. The official protectors, the reeves, beadles, or the lord's men-at-arms, walked a narrow line between upholding order and safeguarding their own skin. For the most part, they leaned on customs that blurred religion with law, sometimes believing that God himself would reveal the guilty through ordeals. Over centuries, these rituals would stagger from the surreal to the sadistic. Justice was often a spectacle. The entire community, traumatized by the loss, expected not only retribution, but a form of cleansing, both practical and spiritual. This relentless pursuit was not due merely to bloodlust, but to the desperate need to understand and contain the darkness lurking at the heart of their world. That darkness was given a name with every new crime, every fresh body, every set of baffled footprints on the road. Yet, even as methods evolved, priests and wise women consulted for omens. Barons commissioned mounted patrols, and royal courts expanded their authority. The psycho killer often slipped through the cracks, striking again and again. When finally cornered, These predators faced not a modern trial, but a gauntlet: interrogation, sometimes torture, exposure to the merciless scrutiny of masses, and, ultimately, a punishment as public as their sins. This is the saga of those killers and the world that hunted them. It is the story of Christmann Jennepertinga, the German ogre who haunted the roads for 13 years. Of Peter Neers, whose corpse-strewn path spanned the Holy Roman Empire and who was believed by some to command dark magic. Of England's werewolf of Bedburg, of Iceland's Axlar Bjorn, and France's legendary Gilles de Rais-Swans, a national hero, then a fiend from the blackest nightmares. But it is more than an account of gore and punishment. 'Tis the chronicle of a society grappling with the inexplicably society desperate for order and redemption, fumbling in the dark toward something resembling justice. And it is the story of the communal will, the stubborn, terrified solidarity of ordinary people bound together by fear, and the ceaseless march of those who believed, however imperfectly, that monsters must be named and, in time, destroyed. So, take a seat by the virtual hearth. The wind howls outside. In the comfort of this retelling, let us travel back to an age when little stood between the world of men and the long shadow of the beast within. In the next chapter, we'll delve deeper into the tools of primitive justice, the rituals, superstitions, and brutal ingenuity that guided communities as they tried, against all odds, to unmask and bring to heel the psycho killers in their midst. Part 2. The tools of primitive justice, superstition, customs, and communal might. As the night lifted, revealing a world splattered with dew and rumor, medieval villagers readied themselves to pursue justice not by scientific evidence, but through a whirlwind of customs, rituals, and hard-learned intuition. The story of how communities identified, diagnosed, and ultimately confronted violence is as intricate as any labyrinth that once lay beneath Europe's castles. Every settlement was a living network of suspicion and solidarity. In households bounded by wooden fences or stone walls, news spread like wildfire. If a murder was discovered, the hue and cry burst forth. Bells clamored at the chapel, doors banged open, and men, women, and sometimes even children streamed into the lanes, torches raised to the wind. The village commons became a courtroom, the street a place of pursuit. The rhythm of the search was dictated by ancient patterns, honed by fear and grim necessity. Meeting at first light. Before dawn, elders, the reeve, or the nearest lord's men-at-arms would gather. Roles assigned hunting parties divided a forerunner to future police organizations. The circling of the perimeter with brutal practicality. Locals would encircle the nearest fields, forests, or rivers, watching for footprints or disturbed earth. Guarding the exits. In towns, exits were watched and city gates chained. In villages, riders were dispatched to neighboring settlements with word of the crime. Justice in the medieval world was shot through with the supernatural. The rationality we take for granted today's impartial evidence, careful forensics had yet to take root. Instead, ordeals ritualistic and theological were relied upon, invested with deep social faith. The ordeal of the bier, the most notorious, was this. The accused would be brought before the corpse of the victim, compelled to touch it. If the body bled or moved, guilt was presumed divine fact. While shocking to modern sensibilities, it was feared, and sometimes even respected, by the accused themselves. Trial by water. Those suspected of murder or worse might be bound and dumped into a pond or river. Floating was a sign of guilt. Sinking meant innocence, though the innocent sometimes drowned. Before they could be fished from the depths, ordeal by fire. In rare but storied cases, the accused bore a hot iron. A clean healing wound signaled God's forgiveness. Anyone who survived these rites, whatever, their guilt was often irreparably marked in the eyes of neighbors. Priests wielded enormous power not only as confessors, but as investigators. Their presence was requested to bind the crime with prayer and counsel with the dead for signs of unrest. Retired soldiers, herbalists, or so-called cunning folk also served as local detectives. Their methods ranged from observing animal omens to asking the spirits for vengeance or clues. Confessions sought by pressure. The local priest sometimes exerted subtle pressure, advocating for confession in the hope that the murderer would save his soul before facing justice. Witchcraft accusations. Women who lived on the margins, practicing healing arts, faced particular danger if local deaths could not otherwise be explained. A few towns transformed failed murder investigations into witch hunts, leading to executions by burning or drowning. Collective memory was the village's true weapon. Everyone knew which neighbor had a quick temper, who had quarreled with the victim, who came home late or appeared suddenly well off. In these places, serial killers found it difficult to hide. Yet, some still did, aided by the movement of strangers, wars that caused chaos, or the shadowed paths frequented by vagrants and bandits. Suspicion grew from tiny seeds: an odd stain, a bit of blood, a missing knife, a horse found straying, a door left mysteriously ajar. Rumors could kill as efficiently as swords. When enough suspicion gathered, the suspect's home might be searched, or their person taken by brute force to the manor court or the dungeon below the local church. Memory and custom worked in tandem. The murdrum fina remnant from Saxon and Norman times imposed heavy penalties on communities that failed to catch a murderer. This meant villagers policed each other, lest the entire hamlet be bankrupted by one crime. Tithings and frank pledge. Groups of 10 households, known as tithings, were each responsible for the crimes of their members. If a killer slipped away, relatives and neighbors paid a fine or suffered collective punishment. Local juries, 12 good men and true. The early roots of jury trials sometimes sat to decide guilt, though they relied almost solely on reputation and rumor. Once named as a suspect, a villager endured more than silent glances. The court of public opinion was merciless stones hurled, homes burned, entire families outcast or forced into exile. In towns large enough to warrant it, stocks and pillories held the shamed for days, exposed to every form of ridicule and abuse. If the accused fled, they became an outlaw, with a price on their head and the risk of being killed by anyone. Some, wrongly accused, lived for years in forests or sought sanctuary in the church, clinging to the hope that the fury of justice would eventually pass. More terrifying still were the killers who were not locals' highwaymen, marauding bandits, or fleeing soldiers seeking shelter. Their appearance in a village might presage sudden violence. The night stranglers, bogmen, or wanderers with serpent eyes grew in the telling, their stories twisted and amplified by fear. Communities learned to respond by closing gates at dusk, stationing guards on the roads, or refusing all hospitality to strangers during times of crisis. In some years, bands of roving killers made travel impossible except under armed escort or as part of a large defensive group. It was in this wildly unstable world that the stage was set for the greatest criminal legends of the age, the men and women whose cunning, savagery, or sheer luck allowed them to elude capture for far longer than their luckless victims. The concept of vengeance marked nearly every response to murder in the Middle Ages. In some regions, the victim's family was not only allowed but expected to hunt and kill the perpetrator. Blood feuds could erupt, transforming communities into battlegrounds, with the cycle continuing until the thirst for blood was finally quenched. Only with the growth of royal authority, kings and queens, demanding that the king's peace take priority, did the wildest forms of revenge begin to fade from dominance. But in the backlands, far from the watchful eyes of kings, the old customs endured, as each crime shocked, bewildered, and devastated tight-knit communities. Memories sharpened, customs ossified, and the rituals of primitive justice deepened their roots. The actual psycho killers, those whose crimes could not be explained by anger or accident, became legends whispered late at night, their true stories slowly congealing into myth over generations. But While superstition ruled the first encounter with evil, a grimly inventive practicality soon joined the hunt. The next evolution: the rise of the dungeon, the torturer's chamber, and the ironclad apparatus of authority bent on extracting confession and inflicting unforgettable retribution. Part 3. The dungeon's door opens captivity, torment, and medieval prisons. Step beyond the threshold of a medieval castle or down the moss-cloaked stairs below a bustling town hall, and you enter a world few ever escaped. Medieval prisons, more accurately called dungeons, were less institutions of reform and more waiting rooms for suffering, confession, and execution. For those accused of unthinkable crimes, especially murder or serial violence, these stone-ribbed tombs represented society's darkest hopes for justice and deterrence. When a suspect was caught a splash of blood on their tunic, a covetous neighbor's finger pointing, a terrible story told around the fire, they were rarely read any rights. Bound in heavy ropes or clapped in irons, they were dragged through jeering crowds, spat upon, sometimes beaten, and shoved inside the narrow maw of the local jail. The air within was always cold, always damp, thick with decades of rot and dread. In smaller towns, a jail might be a reinforced storeroom, barely wide enough to stand. In castles or cities, suspects disappeared into labyrinthine cellars, some with bricked-up oubliette spits designed not for confinement but for utter oblivion. The further beneath the earth, the lesser the light. The more advanced the dungeon, the greater the cruelty of its design. Cells had no furnishings, only straw and filth. Windows, if any, were slit-like, designed to allow shrieks to escape, but not hope. Rats were constant companions, and the fetid pools of water that gathered on the floor became breeding grounds for insects and disease. Prisoners suffered from exposure in winter and suffocation in summer, clad in their soiled rags, left to gnaw on crusts of bread or hard cheese. Their guards were not officers but thugs, poorly paid, easily bribed, and often sadistic. Shackles and stocks kept prisoners immobilized, while iron collars attached to chains to prevent any movement except the slow shuffle of misery. The manacle winch might suspend the doomed upside down, promoting panic and hallucinations, or else stretch their arms to the limits of the body's endurance. To the endless ache of limbs and bellies was added the psychic terror of ceaseless darkness and noise. Screams filtered through the stones, some prayers, others curses, but all testament to a torment that stretched beyond the imagination of ordinary folk. Hope clawed at the edge of madness. Some confessed to crimes they did not commit, simply to end the agony. In famous dungeons like the Tower of London or the crypt prisons below Paris, scribbled graffiti survives marks of desperate souls. Mercy, O Lord, and I die innocent. Sometimes a fellow prisoner turned informant, lured by the promise of freedom or coin, ensuring that every whispered complaint could be twisted into a confession. Justice, in this age, was inextricably linked to spectacle and pain. The most serious suspects, those thought to be serial killers, heretics, or practitioners of forbidden arts, were led to the dreaded question chamber. Here, the torturer waited, professional, methodical, and shielded by the law. The rack stretched bodies until joints dislocated, intended not to kill, but to extract names, confessions, or accomplices. Thumbscrews and wedge boots crushed soft flesh and bone. The strapito hoisted prisoners upward by their arms, behind their backs, often resulting in permanent paralysis. Water tortured pouring streams into the nostrils or forcing drink until the prisoner could barely breathe was common in Spain and Italy. The Church, ironically, sometimes condemned brutality in word, but permitted it for the greater good of society. Inquisitors believed the soul must be saved, even if the body was destroyed. Prisoners never made it to their trial or execution. Starvation, exposure, and disease killed as surely as any headsman or pyre. Jail fever, later identified as typhus, was a frequent visitor, especially when medieval justice demanded mass detentions after a string of unsolved murders. The very design of the dungeon reinforced society's condemnation. You were not only physically restrained, but spiritually abandoned. Rumors held that ghosts haunted these places, animated by restless souls, cheated of true justice, or driven to madness by pain. First days, new prisoners suffered the shock of cold, the terror of the unknown, and the initial rough handling of guards and fellow inmates. Interrogation, sometimes immediate, sometimes after days or weeks of deprivation. Torture was not automatic, but frighteningly common, its use calibrated by the severity of the crime and the status of the accused. Confession stage. Most trials required confession. Those who held out too long risked being listed as obstinate and treated even more harshly, awaiting judgment. If confession was won, the victim awaited public execution. If not, a lucky few might be ransomed, exiled, or, on truly rare occasions, released. The Tower of London. Its White Tower dungeons held traitors and repeat murderers, ensuring that survival depended on influence as much as innocence. Château de Loches, France, contained one of the most notorious oubliettes, a forgotten cell, where condemned men were left to starve in pitch blackness. Venice's Pazzi and Piombi, small, waterlogged chambers and lead-roofed cells that roasted prisoners with the sun. Escape? Almost never. Escapes were virtually unheard. Stone, steel, and the threat of summary execution for any aiding jailer meant that only the most fortunate or devious evaded captivity. Stories grew of killers vanishing into secret tunnels or transforming into animals. Tales, born less of truth and more of society's desperation for hope or explanation. But while prison was almost always a prelude to execution, there lingered the perverse possibility that confinement itself could be punishment enough. In some regions, the worst criminals rotted in darkness for years, voices lost, names forgotten, living warnings in the unending ledger of mankind's battles with evil. The stage was set. When judgment at last was pronounced, the next act began: punishment. In the next part, we march from the dungeon's corridors to the public squares, where justice, reprisal, and horror were played out before entire communities. And the spectacle of medieval execution reached its dreadful crescendo. Part 3. The dungeon's door opens captivity, torment, and medieval prisons. Step beyond the threshold of a medieval castle, or down the moss-cloaked stairs below a bustling town hall, and you enter a world few ever escaped. Medieval prisons, more accurately called dungeons, were less institutions of reform and more waiting rooms for suffering, confession, and execution. For those accused of unthinkable crimes, especially murder or serial violence, these stone-ribbed tombs represented society's darkest hopes for justice and deterrence. When a suspect was caught a splash of blood on their tunic, a covetous neighbor's finger pointing, a terrible story told around the fire, they were rarely read any rights. Bound in heavy ropes or clapped in irons, they were dragged through jeering crowds, spat upon, sometimes beaten, and shoved inside the narrow maw of the local jail. The air within was always cold, always damp, thick with decades of rot and dread. In smaller towns, a jail might be a reinforced storeroom, barely wide enough to stand. In castles or cities, suspects disappeared into labyrinthine cellars, some with bricked-up oubliette spits designed not for confinement, but for utter oblivion. The further beneath the earth, the lesser the light. The more advanced the dungeon, the greater the cruelty of its design. Cells had no furnishings, only straw and filth. Windows, if any, were slit-like, designed to allow shrieks to escape, but not hope. Rats were constant companions, and the fetid pools of water that gathered on the floor became breeding grounds for insects and disease. Prisoners suffered from exposure in winter and suffocation in summer, clad in their soiled rags, left to gnaw on crusts of bread or hard cheese. Their guards were not officers, but thugs, poorly paid, easily bribed, and often sadistic. Shackles and stocks kept prisoners immobilized. while iron collars attached to chains to prevent any movement except the slow shuffle of misery. The manacle winch might suspend the doomed upside down, promoting panic and hallucinations, or else stretch their arms to the limits of the body's endurance. To the endless ache of limbs and bellies was added the psychic terror of ceaseless darkness and noise. Screams filtered through the stones. Some prayers, others curses, but all testament to a torment that stretched beyond the imagination of ordinary folk. Hope clawed at the edge of madness. Some confessed to crimes they did not commit, simply to end the agony. In famous dungeons like the Tower of London or the crypt prisons below Paris, scribbled graffiti survives marks of desperate souls. Mercy, O Lord, and I die innocent. Sometimes a fellow prisoner turned informant, lured by the promise of freedom or coin, ensuring that every whispered complaint could be twisted into a confession. Justice in this age was inextricably linked to spectacle and pain. The most serious suspects, those thought to be serial killers, heretics, or practitioners of forbidden arts, were led to the dreaded question chamber. Here the torturer waited, professional, methodical, and shielded by the law. The rack stretched bodies until joints dislocated, intended not to kill, but to extract names, confessions, or accomplices. Thumbscrews and wedge boots crushed soft flesh and bone. The strapito hoisted prisoners upward by their arms, behind their backs, often resulting in permanent paralysis. Water tortured pouring streams into the nostrils or forcing drink until the prisoner could barely breathe was common in Spain and Italy. The Church, ironically, sometimes condemned brutality in word, but permitted it for the greater good of society. Inquisitors believed the soul must be saved, even if the body was destroyed. Prisoners never made it to their trial or execution. Starvation, exposure, and disease killed as surely as any headsman or pyre. Jail fever, later identified as typhus, was a frequent visitor, especially when medieval justice demanded mass detentions after a string of unsolved murders. The very design of the dungeon reinforced society's condemnation. You were not only physically restrained, but spiritually abandoned. Rumors held that ghosts haunted these places, animated by restless souls, cheated of true justice, or driven to madness by pain. First days, new prisoners suffered the shock of cold, the terror of the unknown, and the initial rough handling of guards and fellow inmates. Interrogation, sometimes immediate, sometimes after days or weeks of deprivation. Torture was not automatic, but frighteningly common, its use calibrated by the severity of the crime and the status of the accused. Confession stage. Most trials required confession. Those who held out too long risked being listed as obstinate and treated even more harshly, awaiting judgment. If confession was won, the victim awaited public execution. If not, a lucky few might be ransomed, exiled, or, on truly rare occasions, released. The Tower of London. Its White Tower dungeons held traitors and repeat murderers, ensuring that survival depended on influence as much as innocence. Château de Loches, France, contained one of the most notorious oubliettes, a forgotten cell, where condemned men were left to starve in pitch blackness. Venice's Pazzi and Piombi, small waterlogged chambers and lead-roofed cells that roasted prisoners with the sun. Escape, almost never. Escapes were virtually unheard. Stone, steel, and the threat of summary execution for any aiding jailer meant that only the most fortunate or devious evaded captivity. Stories grew of killers vanishing into secret tunnels or transforming into animals. Tales, born less of truth and more of society's desperation for hope or explanation. But while prison was almost always a prelude to execution, there lingered the perverse possibility that confinement itself could be punishment enough. In some regions, the worst criminals rotted in darkness for years, voices lost, names forgotten, living warnings in the unending ledger of mankind's battles with evil. The stage was set. When judgment at last was pronounced, the next act began. punishment. In the next part, we march from the dungeon's corridors to the public squares where justice, reprisal, and horror were played out before entire communities. Ow! And the spectacle of medieval execution reached its dreadful crescendo. Part 5. The Dance of Death Executions and Punishment. The gavel's echo, the confession's wailing end, and the public's howl of both satisfaction and horror all signaled one thing. The medieval process was shifting from judgment to the climactic theater of punishment. Rare was the village or town that did not shudder, yet secretly thrill as they prepared for the spectacle. For the psycho killers whose deeds had gripped the community in terror, only a punishment as extraordinary as their crimes would suffice, preferably one that, in its awful spectacle, might scare future monsters back into the darkness from which they came. On execution days, business paused. Markets closed, and children perched on their fathers' shoulders for a clearer view. The baker stopped kneading. Soldiers appeared in their finest tunics. The clergy donned black or crimson to pray for the soul or for vengeance. These punishments were not merely retributive. They were deliberate performances, not only to end evil, but to ensure its memory burned in terrified minds for generations. Execution locations had their own dark grandeur. The gallows sat on a hill, visible for miles. The public square's raised platform, splattered and reused. City gates, stained with sorrow. In rare but memorable cases, the killer met their end at the scene of their most notorious crime. Forced to view the specters of their victims as the town watched in silent dread. Foremost among horrors stood the breaking wheel, a monstrous contraption that elevated cruelty to artistry. The condemned limbs, splayed and bound, was lashed onto a heavy wagon wheel or wooden crosspiece. An executioner wielded a heavy bar or sledgehammer, systematically crushing the arms, legs, and finally ribs, according to a grim choreography, sometimes pausing between each blow for the crowd to jeer or spit. Christmann Jennepertinga, the blood-chilling German roadkiller, faced this fate after his subterranean cave of corpses was exposed. Each shattering strike was both punishment and warning. Here bled the monster, and here justice ended his reign. To die quickly was a mercy rarely granted. Some lingered for hours or longer, with a final, fatal blow sometimes granted by a parish priest's plea for coup de grace. Hanging, drowning, and the rope's judgment. The most common punishment for murder was hanging. Wooden gallows stood waiting, ropes coiled like snakes. For towns in the lowlands, a bridge or riverbank sufficed, slinging the condemned over running water, believing the river would wash away the soul's blackness, or that the flowing stream carried justice onward into the world. A single killer, his body jerking in the morning sun, became a lesson visible to traders, children, and pilgrims alike. But notorious murderers, especially those suspected of killing for pleasure, sometimes suffered multiple hangings, strangled to near death, revived and hanged again while a crowd chanted relentlessly. Burning at the stake. Witch, poisoner, and fiend. Burning, more than any other medieval punishment, fused judicial wrath with spiritual dread. Poisoners, those who killed by unnatural means or whose crimes involved rumors of demonic rites, met the flame's embrace. Women accused of serial murder, called witches or even monsters, were bound fast to posts piled high with green wood fuel that prolonged the agony. Elizabeth, the infamous Blood Countess of Hungary, was bricked within her castle for crimes too heinous for ordinary execution. But hundreds of lesser-known poisoners and child killers lit the night skies from Paris to Prague. Townspeople, both horrified and relived, crowded to the edges of the pyre's heat. Incantations rose. Ashes drifted on the wind, and sometimes charred bones were scattered at crossroads to further ensure the criminal's spirit could not return. Executions for the noble born. The clean blade. Lords and knights, caught for serial murder or crimes black enough to shame the realm, occasionally faced the sword. Beheading was, in theory, a privilege, a quick, clean exit from mortal shame. Yet crowds sometimes demanded the headsman botch his work, prolonging the noble killer's suffering. Gilles de Rais, once celebrated as France's greatest knight, was hanged and then burned in a double spectacle that drew nobles and commons alike to witness the justice that would consume both the body and the social memory of Cudo. Cudo says into monstrousness. For those whose crimes seem to threaten the entire kingdom's serial killers, especially if linked with treason or terror, the punishments escalated. Dismemberment, drawing and quartering, and public flaying marked the most infamous executions. In England, drawing and quartering involved hanging the criminal partially, then cutting open the abdomen, tearing out entrails, and finally hacking the body into 4 pieces each, sent to a different part of the kingdom, riding at the front of the king's justice. Severed heads spiked on city gates reminded travelers that the long arm of law sometimes wore the face of revenge, ritual, and mercy in punishment. While brutality ruled, not all executions were orgies of pain. Some condemned, broken by weeks in the dungeon, confessed and begged for a swift end. Priests sometimes pressed for a merciful final blow. In rare acts of repentance, a killer's final words, confession, apology, frantic prayer were recorded by chroniclers, either to humble the dead or warn the living. Here lies the fate of those who transgress beyond all mercy. The tale's end, and something worse, the refusal of burial. Justice stabbed even at the afterlife. Murderers were buried in unmarked graves, at crossroads, or outside unconsecrated ground, forever damned to wander. Their names became curses, their stories a byword for evil. The spectacle, the pain, the public witness served one grand purpose: to restore order, reassure the frightened, and etch into the communal memory what it meant to break the natural laws that bound the living to the dead. But even as law tightened its grip, sometimes the most cunning, depraved, or charming managed to slip through looting dungeons, courts, and ropes. Their legacies, as much as their demise, would plant seeds for the next great journey. The legends and lives of the most chilling characters in the chronicles of medieval crime. In the next part, we'll step out of the square, into the haunted woods and endless roads to meet the legendary psycho killers, whose ghosts still stalk the imagination of Europe. Part 6. Roads of Blood, the greatest psycho killers of medieval history. To understand the primal terror felt in medieval Europe, one must venture into its legends of murder. True stories and nightmare fables twisted together, carried on the wind from village to village, growing more monstrous with each telling. These were not mere common cutthroats or desperate thieves, but predators driven by greed, lust, compulsion, or a darkness without name. Their acts stained the roads and rivers, haunted forests, and crept across the land like spreading ink. This is the realm of the medieval psycho killer, a handful of infamous figures whose blood-soaked careers terrorized entire regions, reshaped law, and gave birth to stories that are still whispered centuries later. Christman Jennepertinga, the cave-dwelling ogre. Few outlaws inspired more dread than Christman Jennepertinga, a name synonymous with the monstrous throughout the late 16th century Holy Roman Empire. His liara-twisting network of caves in the wildest German woodlands served as tomb and feeding ground for travelers, peddlers, and unlucky farmers who never finished their journeys. For 13 years, Jennepertinga slipped past rangers and constables, striking at dusk, vanishing at dawn. Not content with mere murder, he hoarded the belongings of his victims, even forging coins from stolen silver. Legends claim he killed 964 people, men, women, children, though modern historians suspect the number, however inflated, is not far from the truth of the terror he spread. His reign ended only when a captive girl, desperate and clever, escaped and led the militia to his lair. There, the full extent of his horror was revealed: bodies in various states of decay, caches of bones, trophies that turned the blood cold. The breaking wheel was judged too merciful. He suffered it for hours as villagers spat and jeered. The echo of his crimes, a warning that would live far longer than the man himself. Peter Nears, the shape-shifting cannibal. Roaming a landscape fractured by war and famine, Peter Nears became a byword for evil in 16th century Germany. Ballads and broadsheets painted him as a practitioner of dark magic, a man who could vanish or even transform at will. His crimes were so brutal they seemed surreal. He confessed, under torture, to the murder of over 500 people, including pregnant women whose unborn children he was said to use in occult rituals. Nears' savagery was matched only by his elusiveness. For years, he led a gang of bandits, evading capture, exploiting chaos in the countryside, and sowing unrest wherever he passed. The perception that he wielded supernatural abilities emerged as his pursuers grew ever more desperate, whispering that he could become invisible, melt through walls, or even change his face. When at last he was betrayed and seized, officials staged a 3-day execution, ensuring each aspect of his legend was punished in turn. Limbs were hacked, flesh burned, wheel turned. The crowd grew so vast, pamphlets reported that it seemed all of Germany had come to rid itself of the darkness he embodied. Gilles de Rais, the Bluebeard of Brittany. No tale of medieval horror eclipses that of Gilles de Rais, a knight, war hero, companion of Joan of Arc, and scion of one of France's wealthiest families. Loved at court, infamous on the battlefield, his fall shocked the entire country. Having retired to his estates, de Rais's tastes grew darker. Witness after witness claimed he lured children, mostly boys, with promises of food or gold, leading them to a fate that would make even the most jaded chronicler blanch. The deaths, possibly numbering in the hundreds, were marked by ritual, torture, and sexual depravity. What drove de Rais is still debated. Was it madness conjured by alchemy, a craving for power, or simply the evolution of a monstrous soul? His trial was an orgy of confession and accusation. Even political enemies seemed awestruck by the depth of his depravity. By order of church and crown alike, he was hanged, then burned, so his spirit would never rise again. Axlar Bjorn, the Axeman of Iceland. Iceland, with its sparse settlements and long winters, rarely knew serial killers. Yet Axlar Bjorn Pedersen became the island's only infamous mass murderer. On his farm, travelers disappeared with alarming frequency. Horses and goods accumulating, bodies vanishing as if the earth itself had swallowed them. Rumors flourished. Was he a werewolf, a cursed child, a simple brute whose soul had rotted in isolation? Accusation at last came when a relative, seeking a missing friend, uncovered remains in an old stream. Bjorn confessed to more than a dozen murders. The locals, some burdened by guilt for ignoring warning signs, others burning for revenge, ensured that his execution was both thorough and public. His limbs were broken, his head taken, and his remains displayed until scavengers picked the bones clean. One of the few times Iceland united in horror. Werewolves, poisoners, and other terrors. Not every legend survived through legal records. Some merged with folklore. In France, the tale of Pierre Berget and Michel Verdun, both werewolves by their confessions under torture, meshed serial child murder with supernatural fears. Young women found guilty of mass poisoning, especially in Italy and Germany, were said to use Satan's recipe book, and suffered at the pyre for sins often exaggerated in the telling. Throughout Europe's forests, stories of night riders, bog stranglers, and ogresses flickered in the firelight, crafting an oral tradition where fact and fiction twisted together, feeding children's nightmares and spurring adults into ever more vigilant communities. Infamy eternal. For those who lived through these terrors, survival meant more than avoiding the criminal's knife. It required making sense of evil at a time when the lines between reality and legend were blurred. These killers, their faces peering from centuries-old woodcuts and manuscripts, continue to haunt not only their homelands, but the modern imagination. Their stories inked the margins of the law, shaping future generations' responses to violence with fear, awe, and sometimes grim admiration for their cunning or audacity. As the medieval era wore on, with each new horror and each fresh rumor, the need for more robust forms of protection and punishment only grew. In the next part, we turn from notorious individuals to the forms of resistance. Medieval communities' ever-adapting efforts to outwit evil and defend the innocent from monsters in human guise. Part 7. Shields against darkness. Community responses and defensive rituals. If fear shaped the medieval world, then resilience and adaptation were its twin shields. Every fresh atrocity, every body found in the woods or child vanished on the road, forced communities to invent new ways to detect, deter, and defend against the threat of psycho killers. Through careful ritual, evolving custom, and an ingenuity born of desperation, these societies fought to hold darkness at bay, sometimes successfully, sometimes at terrible cost. The rise of night watches and defensive communities. In towns and villages where the echo of a killer's deeds still haunted the lanes, a new seriousness took hold. Gone were the lax evenings and open gates. Night watches, volunteers, often men, sometimes older children, roamed the boundaries from dusk until dawn. Their authority was simple. Question any traveler, detain the suspicious, sound the alarm if unfamiliar footsteps cross the fields. These watches evolved into early policing in urban areas. In cities like London, the watch and ward ordinance forced every able-bodied man to patrol in turn, ensuring that no corner was left unguarded. Gate closures and curfews. Towns enacted strict curfews, locking city gates and drawing up bridges at sunset. In smaller villages, barricades of carts and stones were dragged across lanes. Understandable interruptions to trade and travel, but a vital reassurance for anxious families. Passwords and tokens. Travelers after dark needed special tokens or correct passwords to gain entry. The system of let pass evolved. Those without local ties waited the night outside, vulnerable to both monsters and mobs. Building fortified homes and refuges. In areas plagued by notorious serial killers or organized bands of highwaymen, architecture itself adapted. Murder holes and hidden chambers. Castle gatehouses sprouted slots murder holes for boiling tar or arrows to rain down upon besiegers. Some noble homes developed secret passages or panic rooms, a refuge in case killers or bandits forced entry. Communal strongholds. Smaller hamlets pooled resources to build stone towers or churches with reinforced doors and barred windows. During times of crisis, entire families slept in these makeshift fortresses, emerging only with the first birdsong. Ritual protection, magic, faith, and superstition. When the reach of law failed, the medieval imagination conjured other defenses, amulets, prayers, curses, and folk rituals meant to confuse, repel, or identify the murderer lurking among them. Charms and talismans. Herbs, such as rue, garlic, and vervain, were hung above doors or sewn into clothing to repel evil spirits and the malice of the living dead. Some towns invoked saints' relics, parading them through fields while chanting litanies to deter evil. Processions and exorcisms. At the first hint of foul play, the church led processions through the streets, ringing handbells, sprinkling holy water, and invoking Saint Michael or Saint George to shield the community. The ordeal of the bier revisited. If a perpetrator was unknown, the murdered body itself was sometimes paraded through the streets or across the fields, with villagers compelled to lay hands upon it. The hope was that blood, wounds, or movement would signal the true culprit. A macabre mixture of superstition and community theater that sometimes prompted confessions from rattled suspects. Oaths, pacts, and the strengthening of old institutions. Villages re-emphasized the concept of frank pledge, making every 10 or so households responsible for each other's conduct. A system that empowered neighbors to monitor, and at times, control one another. The tithing system bred suspicion, but also mutual dependency. Any sign of harboring a killer, could bring ruin upon innocent and guilty alike. Communities also reinforced oaths of silence or vengeance. The kin of victims sometimes formed formal pacts, swearing before God and witnesses, to avenge the dead or to hunt the suspect to the world's end. These blood oaths could transcend generations, fueling feuds that marred entire regions but deterring would-be killers. Who knew the cost of their action extended far beyond their own lives? Early policing and traveling courts. The rise of serial murder and organized banditry forced rulers to experiment with mobile justice. Traveling judges, kings and princes dispatched teams of judges and bailiffs who rode circuit, dispensing justice where bloodshed was worst. Their presence was double-edged. Local customs were set aside, but the fear of royal attention rendered all but the most reckless killers cautious. Royal rewards and bounties to incentivize the capture of notorious criminals. Rulers set rewards, sometimes as much as a year's wages or a plot of land. In return, informants risked retaliation, but in desperate times, the hope for riches or royal pardon was enough. The spread of news and early investigators. Word of a murder, especially one believably linked to a known killer, spread quickly through markets, monasteries, and churches. Clerics and monks as early detectives, literate, often well-traveled and trusted, monks began recording crimes and noting patterns. Monasteries stored detailed chronicles, sometimes with wanted sketches, a critical tool in tracking itinerant killers whose crimes spanned many regions. Minstrels and balladeers, tales of notorious murders entered song and story, letting villages hundreds of miles away prepare for familiar dangers and recognize the traits or tactics of a psycho killer. The limits and failures of communal defense. Yet, for all their solidarity and ritual, medieval communities were not omnipotent. Killers sometimes exploited the very structures meant to catch them, hiding among kin or posing as devout pilgrims in times of pilgrimage fever. Fear of witchcraft, foreignness, or social outcast made scapegoats of the innocent, sometimes allowing the true monster to walk free. When the defenses failed, tragedy multiplied. Families fell silent, roads emptied, and hope flickered. Still, the willingness to fight terror with unity is perhaps the greatest legacy of these hard-bitten societies. Vigilantism and the shadow side of justice. Where trust failed in officials or church, the mob often took its own control. Lynchings, banishments, and summary justice were not rare. Sometimes families of the accused were driven out, their lands burned, their animals slaughtered. Street justice could be swifter and crueler than anything a lord might pronounce. But in this brutal improvisation lay the roots of future policing. Communal patrols. Investigation. Sworn constables drawn from among the people, all trying, imperfectly and desperately, to catch and contain evil. The living memory. Every murder, every monster, carved a mark not just on a family or town, but in the communal memory. Medieval chronicles record these acts alongside plagues and famines, a testament to the constant struggle to define, confront, and neutralize the psycho killer. In the next part, we'll descend again into the hearts and minds of those who committed these acts. How did medieval society try to probe their motives? Who, among community and chronicler alike, dared to wonder what dwelled in the soul of the monster? Part 8. Inside the monster's mind: motives, madness, and confession. In a world where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural, the known and unknown, blurred upon every sunrise, those who killed again and again became an obsession for chroniclers, priests, and the entire trembling populace. Yet for all their horror and outrage, medieval minds wrestled with a fundamental mystery. Why did these terrible souls kill? What made a murderer into a monster, and did they sense their own evil? Could a soul be saved, or was it already under Satan's grip? What followed was a tumultuous search for understanding, driven by equal parts fascination, terror, ignorance, and the hope that knowledge could prevent the next horror. The language of evil, demon, beast, or broken man. Medieval people didn't have the words psychology or psychopathy in their vocabulary. Instead, chroniclers and priests spoke in terms of possession, curse, or sinful nature. The psycho-killer was rarely seen as simply sick. Instead, he or she was seen as possessed by the devil. Rogue priests, witches, and sorcerers, especially those accused of ritual murders, were treated as agents or vessels of hell itself. Priests conducted exorcisms on the condemned, hoping to drive the devil out before execution, if only to secure the soul in death, transformed into a beast. The werewolf legends weren't just fiction. Records from France and Germany show trial documents with confessions in which murderers insisted they took animal form. Killing and eating flesh, especially of children, was cited as proof that the killer was literally a wolf in man's clothing, born of cursed blood. Families that produced more than one murderer or a lineage suspected of evil saw their line branded as tainted. Folk avoided them, believing the monstrous urge ran in their veins. Madness and the lunatic. The word lunatic, someone driven mad by the influence of the moon, was used for the wildest, most bizarre murderers. A killer's strange laughter or apparent lack of remorse convinced many that evil had rotted the mind itself. Grilled by priest and court, torture and confession. Rarely was motive contented with "I wanted to" or "I needed." Medieval interrogators pressed for answers, employed every tool, regardless of reliability. Torture, pain, was not just for confession of facts, but an attempt to break open the true cause. Who did you serve, God or the devil? Were you paid by witches? Did you make a pact in blood? For women accused of serial poisoning, the pressure was intense to reveal witchcraft or conspiracy, a way for society to make sense of what didn't compute. Confession and repetition. Confessors drove the accused to recite their crimes again and again, hunting for clues of motive. Jealousy, vengeance, lust, or hunger for power. Madness as defense. On rare occasions, especially among the higher born, a plea of madness could delay or soften the sentence. Lords bribed doctors or priests to declare the accused not in his right mind, hoping for prison or monastery confinement instead of death. The killer's own words, fascination and terror. Some psycho-killers, whether broken by prison or intoxicated with their own story, shocked everyone with their boasting. Boasting and bragging. Peter Neers was said between bouts of agony to laugh and taunt his jailers, telling of crimes even darker than those already revealed. Gilles Desrosiers described his excesses in ritualistic detail as if reliving a perverted liturgy, guilt and despair. Others, especially after harsh torture or when death's finality loomed, broke down in agony. They pleaded for forgiveness, wept, or begged for a priest's blessing. Stories spread of last-minute remorse, hope for solace in oblivion. Blame and denial. A few clung to their innocence, blaming enemies, demons, or fate, right until the final bell rang. Even confessions, chroniclers noted, were sometimes riddled with contradictions, testament to fragile minds, battered bodies, and souls lost in the labyrinth of guilt and terror. Chronicler, balladeer, and the legacy of motive. What then did medieval society ultimately make of the psycho-killer's motives? Chroniclers and court scribes. Official documents painted motives in stark terms. Unnatural lust, devil's servant, beast in human shape. Few attempted deeper understanding. The crime itself was so shocking, nuance felt obscene. Balladeers and storytellers. Over time, raw details softened. Motives grew grandiose. Crimes linked to ancient prophecies, curses, or wrongs done generations before. The psycho-killer's origin became fable fuel-proof that evil could strike anywhere, anytime. Monastic scholars. A handful of monks recorded more reflective, even philosophical musings. Manuscripts from abbeys in Italy and Germany featured debates about whether the soul was ever beyond redemption, or whether even monsters could repent if given true grace. the attempt to understand. Science's first flickers. Toward the end of the medieval era, especially in the great cities, scholars began to suspect that recurring violence was not always supernatural. Simple melancholy, black bile, or moon madness entered the vocabulary. Physicians post-mortem examined skulls, noting abnormalities or speculating on congenital marks of evil. These early theories, half science, half magic, paved the way for future criminology, but had little effect during the lifetimes of medieval killers. The last words. Confessions that echo through time. No ending sin was complete without a final moment of spectacle. Confessions, real or imagined, were performed from the scaffolds, sometimes broadcast by herald or sung by the crowd as a warning, a blend of true remorse, forced penance, and ritual exorcism. The words of the condemned, whether tearful or defiant, burned into communal memory, both salt on the wound and balm for the living, a final, ambiguous attempt to answer the question why. In the next part, we follow the fate of those left in evil's wake, the families of victims, communities scarred by terror, and the legends these experiences kindled for generations to come. Part 9. Aftermath, families, communities, and the weight of the past. The tale of the medieval psycho killer did not end with confession, execution, or even the purging flames of the stake. For those left behind, victims' families, haunted villages, and survivors large and small, that aftermath lingered like a shadow that crept across generations. Evil, once unleashed, proved stubbornly hard to contain. Its mark was not only upon those who bled, but upon every heart, home, and tradition scorched by fear and loss. The families, grief, shame, and unending questions. For families of the murdered, justice never truly closed the wound. Loss was as much an everyday ache as a public cry. Brothers and fathers sometimes took long detours rather than pass the spot where a loved one was found. Mothers taught their children to avoid thick woods and shadowed wells, no matter the hour. Grief and remembering, with no photographs or police reports. The dead were memorialized in stories, pilgrimages to the site, prayers whispered at makeshift roadside shrines. Churches might add the victim's name to the litany of saints invoked for protection. Social fallout. In places where the criminal and the victim were kin or even former friends, the pain multiplied. Feuds persisted between families, leading to disputes, brawls, and cold, unhealable rifts that sometimes lasted longer than the original crime. Burial and soul care. Bodies recovered from psycho killers were buried with special rites, extra prayers, relics laid in the earth, and, when possible, dirt from the Holy Land or sainted sites to offer protection in the afterlife. The suspect's kin, marked by blood. The kin of the condemned faced a scourge all their own. Public shame, suspicion, and, at worst, retribution. Ostracism and exile. Villages branded houses, destroyed crops, and banished entire bloodlines. Names became synonymous with evil. Innocent infants and cousins grew in isolation, marked by another's crime. Confiscation and poverty. Land and property were often seized to pay for investigative expenses and execution costs, leaving wives and children destitute. Changing names and disappearance. Some families chose or were forced to change surnames, moving far away in hopes of escaping a legacy that followed like a curse. Communities, scars, rituals, and caution. Whole villages reeled after a rampage. The need to explain, exercise, and prevent future violence birthed new rituals and cautionary changes. Collective mourning, masses and processions wove through towns, sometimes for days, as priests led prayers for protection and sang the names of both victims and the place itself, sanctifying traumatized ground. Renewed defenses, crescents sharpened, gates reinforced, and night patrols strengthened, all in the hope that new evil would not return. Taboos and new customs. Certain places, forests, crossroads, fields gained new taboos. Children were warned not to play after dark. Women traveled in groups, solitary beggars sometimes driven off as potential threats, reigniting the cycle feuds, forgiveness, and punishment's reach. Beyond official justice, feuds blossomed in the aftermath of terror. Vendetta and private vengeance. In places where royal or church courts failed or were seen as too lenient, family or clan vengeance ensured the bloodshed did not end. Killers' relatives might be targeted, or whole families caught in chains of violence. Cursed to reenact the original crime's horror for years. Forgiveness and ritual peace. Yet sometimes, with exhaustion and the passing of years, families and villages sought formal reconciliation, married each other's children, hosted ceremonial feasts, or took part in public acts of atonement to lift the specter of violence and restore communal peace. The psychological toll, suspicion, and silence. In the wake of a killing spree, trust became a casualty. The price was subtle, but high. Suspicion of outsiders, travelers, and newcomers. Once sources of fresh stories or news were now regarded with wariness. Hospitality became a well-guarded mercy, offered grudgingly lest the cycle repeat. Suppression of memories. Some towns, unable or unwilling to process the events, imposed silence. Records burned, stories left untold, and memorials avoided lest the past draw back its ghostly hand. Yet, these efforts failed to truly erase the nightmares. Trauma festered, resurfacing in whispers and warnings. As the decades passed, memory and myth danced together. Over time, the concrete memory of the killer faded. What remained was a story, the tale of the monster on the road, the warning of the wolf at the door, or the legend of forbidden woods where the dead still wandered. Saints and monsters. Some victims were posthumously imagined as saints or folk martyrs, with cures or signs attributed to their bones. Others exhumed as restless spirits until the killer's name was purged from communal memory. Annual rites and stories. Even centuries later, festivals or processions might skirt the forbidden field or forest. And children's games adopted macabre lyrics warning of the dangers that once prowled these lands. The weight of the past. The shadow left by psycho killers was never entirely banished. It echoed in customs, shaped boundaries, and most of all, in the stories passed from old to young. The trauma of violence and the quest for justice became part of the very identity of a place and its people. Yet in this inheritance of pain, there flickered resilience. Each generation's promise to keep its children safer, its enemies closer, and, when necessary, to gather by torch and bell and face the darkness together. Against the psycho killer's reign, the ultimate medieval shield was always collective memory. The iron belief that gather, even evil, could be denied its final triumph. In the last part of our saga, we'll trace these stories out of the Middle Ages, exploring how the legacy of medieval justice, terror, and memory paved the way for new forms of law, order, and understanding in the modern world. Part 10. Legacy and Reflection. How the medieval battle with evil shaped our world. History is shaped not merely by kings and conquerors, but by the struggles of ordinary people facing extraordinary evil. The long medieval battle against psycho killers, those whose crimes chilled blood, shattered faith, and warped the very notion of safety, left profound marks. Its lessons, scars, and legends have echoed forward into the Age of Enlightenment and beyond, shaping both our horror stories and our systems of justice to this very day. The written record, from chronicle to casebook. Out of the horror and confusion of medieval murder grew a relentless desire to record, understand, and prevent such horrors. Chronicles and legal scrolls. Early records, often composed by clerics or town scribes, enumerated not just the crimes, but their rituals, motives, and the methods of capture and punishment. These texts, half warning, half history, became templates for future legal codes, from ballad to blueprint. As tales of infamous killers passed into song and oral tradition, they also took root in early criminal statutes. Rules for night watches, procedures for accusation and trial, and clear guidelines on collective responsibility all matured in the forges of fear. These customs evolved into the first police ordinances in Europe, giving birth to the urban constable and court detective. The transformation of justice. The wild, chaotic tapestry of medieval justice steadily transformed into something more measured, systematic, and less tied to spectacle. Decline of ordeal and spectacle. By the late Middle Ages, the spectacle of torture and public execution slowly began to wane, though not without resistance. A gradual rise of Renaissance rationalism, coupled with a growing awareness of false confessions and mob violence, forced rulers and lawmakers to seek more objective forms of proof, eventually paving the way for the evidentiary systems we recognize today. Emergence of custodial imprisonment. The medieval dungeon, once a place of temporary torment and inevitable execution, slowly evolved into the prison as corrective institution. The idea that one could be both contained and reformed, rather than merely destroyed, took hold. Early experiments with prisoner work gangs, penance, and parchment records of good behavior foreshadowed the modern penitentiary. Separation of law and superstition. Witch trials, ordeals of the bier, and possessions were gradually replaced by cross-examination, medical testimony, and early forensic efforts, tiny flickers of modern criminal psychology. Perhaps the most lasting legacy is conceptual. The move from seeing the psycho killer as merely the tool of Satan, a cursed bloodline, or an animal in human skin, and toward understanding criminality as a social and psychological phenomenon. Rise of criminal profiling, lawmen, and chroniclers, notably in the later centuries, began to note patterns, repeated behaviors, favored times and victims, common ruses. This pattern seeking would much later flower into the field of criminal profiling and forensic psychology. Medical and moral explanations. Increasingly, criminal madness was described as an illness, not merely a sin. Early modern doctors dissected the remains of notorious killers, searching for physical marks of depravity. While primitive, these attempts marked the beginning of the study of abnormal psychology. Birth of public awareness. The telling and retelling of these stories gave rise to a new genre of pamphlet and balladeurly true crime. The beginnings of the public's fascination with real-life horror not only warned of danger, but also fostered calls for legal reform and victim support. The enduring power of the tale. Long after dungeons crumbled and the breaking wheel rusted, the memory of medieval psycho killers continued to haunt literature and law. Legends and fairy tales. Many of the most enduring European fairy tale stories of ogres, child snatchers, and witches find their roots in medieval responses to serial killers. Names changed, motives blurred, but the warning remained. Beware the road at night. The stranger who smiles, the desire for easy gain. Moral and legal boundaries. The absolute horror attached to these crimes established murder, especially senseless or repeated murder, as the ultimate violation of social order, a standard which continues in modern law and the markedly severe punishments reserved for serial offenses. Lessons for the modern world. Today, confronted by violence and evil, we rely on fingerprint powder, DNA tests, criminal databases, and psychological assessment tools, unimaginable to a medieval villager anxiously tracing footprints by torchlight. But the spirit of community, vigilance, resilience, and the quest for order lives on. Community participation. The tradition of hue and cry survives in the communal impulse to mobilize in moments of crisis, be it searching for a missing person or supporting victims of crime. Warning and memory. Our true crime documentaries, podcasts, and cautionary tales continue the medieval role of warning the public, processing horror, and seeking collective healing. Justice and complexity. We strive to be just and thorough, aware that behind each monstrous act can sometimes lie unfathomable pain, madness, or history, and that compassion for the innocent must always remain at the heart of justice. Medieval Europe's long twilight, reborn by darkness. but pierced by stubborn candles gave us a legacy both terrifying and enlightening. From the bones of monsters and the tears of the grieving came both caution and progress, a persistent striving to cast light into the forest of the human soul. As you close this journey, reflect on the world still shaped by that distant struggle the laws made in fear, the tales meant to explain, and a civilization forever turning toward hope. In the end, the most vital lesson endures. Against the psycho killer, the only lasting shield was humanity itself, flawed, fierce, and, in the end, always determined to survive.